I would like to welcome you to the podcast, Kwok and Roll. I am your host, Kwok Pui Lan. Today, we'll have a panel discussion on Justin Se's book, Ships of Scattered Sand, Cantonese Protestants and the Secular Dream of the Pacific Rim. Justin will introduce his book, and our panelists, Melissa Borja, Casey Choi, and ChanHee Heo, will offer their comments. I will introduce them before they speak, and you can post your comments and questions in the chat room. Dr. Justin Se is Assistant Professor of Religion and Culture at Singapore Management University's College of Integrative Studies. He is the author of the book we will discuss, Ships of Scattered Sand, and co-editor of Springer's Handbook of Geographies of Religion. He teaches courses such as the Publics and Privates on the Pacific Rim, and Sovereignties and Secularities, Political Theology in Postcolonial and Planetary Context. Congratulations to Justin for your book. Please introduce it to the audience.
Well, thanks, Pui Lan. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And thanks to Melissa and Casey and ChanHee for discussing it. I'm looking forward to a great conversation. What I want to do today is I want to set the table with the title of my book, Sheets of Scattered Sand, Cantonese Protestants and the Secular Dream of the Pacific Rim. So Sheets of Scattered Sand is my rogue translation of the Cantonese. It was a term I heard often during my fieldwork in 2011 and 2012 among Cantonese-speaking Protestant Christians. I shortened that to Cantonese Protestants. In the Pacific Rim societies of the San Francisco Bay Area, Metro Vancouver, and Hong Kong. This term, yapun sansa, literally translated, conjures the image of a container with grains of sand scattered on it. Those I spoke with in these societies referred to themselves with this word picture. They had been portrayed in American, Canadian, and Hong Kong media as a new political bloc from the late 1980s to about the time that I was studying them in the early 2010s. And most of their politics revolved around opposing same-sex marriage and transgender rights, justifying the existence of their churches and social service work in zones and buildings that did not traditionally house religious groups, and joining political parties that seemed to the liberal press as moving towards the right. But as I reflected on what the Cantonese Protestants I spoke to always said, I talked to 142 people, I did 13 focus groups, I did an audiovisual archive. They were actually communities that were given to infighting and ideological disunity. So for every person who joined the Conservative Party or Republican Party, there was always someone else who thought that the church should remain neutral, or that a more radical democratic politics was in order, or that those other people, whatever their political position or moral conviction or biblical reading, were just too political or not political enough. It was in these contexts that I encountered the term yapun sansa, which I translate into a sheet of scattered sand. So in some ways, yapun sansa can be attributed to the critics of the founder of the Chinese nation, Sun Yat-sen, Xun Zhongsan, although Sun Yat-sen used the term sheet of loose sand, yapin sansa, to describe Chinese people. So Sun's critics were criticizing him for trying to construct a nation out of people with no sense of peoplehood, whose loyalties were only to their clans and communities and families. The Sun Yat-sen, of course, felt that the term was ironic, because if every Chinese person is, as the term suggests, doing their own thing, the one thing that no Chinese person ever needed to be taught was freedom. To be scattered is to be free already. So Sun's term was a literal flat sheet, yapin, whereas my ethnographic respondents kept to saying yapun. A pun is a container, a pot, a tray, if you will. So I split the difference by remaining agnostic as to the depth of the tray. And that's why my translation of the colloquial term yapun sansa is a sheet of scattered sand. So there are two parts to this term. Yapun sansa, a sheet of scattered sand. The first was what Cantonese Protestants were telling me, that they were prone to infighting and so on. But the scattered sands were only one part of the term. Implicitly, there's also a sheet. And where the sands are scattered matters. So mirroring this analogy, there's also a dual movement in this book. So as I write about how Cantonese Protestants are frustrated about being scattered and often yearned at the time for a deeper sense of political unity. And that political unity, you might say, they got after 2012, after the time I'm writing about, with the advent of a new kind of Chinese cultural nationalism under Xi Jinping. I also write about how they were responding to the sheet. The external container that I'm claiming actually held them together. And so as they would have described it, it would have been the secular outside of their churches. But that secularity was itself in constant flux, embedded as it was, as I call it in this book, the dream of the Pacific Rim. And so it's in this way that Sheets of Scattered Sand situates Cantonese Protestants in the time between 1989 and 2012 in the larger fantasy that I am calling the dream of the Pacific Rim. So the main scholarly contribution is to offer, through the prism of Cantonese Protestant communities, the beginnings of a theological reimagination of the Pacific Rim. In this sense, the Pacific Rim operates as a powerful imaginary that powers civil societies that have vied for their place as political, economic, and cultural hubs connecting Asia and the Americas. The sheet that I am working on is not just the secular, which is the world outside of the churches of Cantonese Protestants. That secularity was particular to the formation of what was called at the time the Pacific Rim, which signals not just a geographical region that attempts to integrate Asia, the Americas, and Australia and New Zealand, but also, more importantly, a set of liberal imaginaries that at the time idealized multicultural civil societies and proffered a vague sense of democratic participation in places like Hong Kong, San Francisco, and Vancouver. So there is, I must also stress, no single institutional entity that represents the Pacific Rim as a whole. It is better conceived, I suggest, as a dream, as a geographical imagination built on wishful thinking, as describing ideological content that circulated through civil societies and private institutions that claimed to be operating autonomously from one another. So Sheets of Scattered Sand addresses this dual movement, the scattering of the Cantonese Protestants on the secular dream of the Pacific Rim prior to 2012. So with that, my time is up. I'm deeply thankful for this panel, for discussing this book. I look forward to the conversation to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin. Our first panelist is Dr. Melissa Borja, who is Associate Professor of American Culture and Asian Pacific Islander American Studies at the University of Michigan. A historian of migration, religion, race, and politics, she is the author of the award-winning book, Follow the New Way, American Refugee Resettlement Policy and Hmong Religious Change. She advised Princeton's Religion and Forced Migration Initiative and leads the Virulent Hate Project, which investigates anti-Asian racism during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation about a book I love very much and a scholar I admire very much as well. So I want to talk about a couple different aspects of the book that I find really compelling and then end on a reflection about what this book means in this moment or could mean. The first thing that I love about this book is that it is really a beautiful example of what it means to do transpacific, transnational scholarship on religious life. Now, we've been saying that in the study of American religion for a long time and Asian American religion for a long time. Justin actually does it, and beautifully so. So I love that he looks at different sites on the Pacific Rim, knowing that the Pacific Rim is an idea, but also a variety of places. I love that he looks at Hong Kong and Canada and the U.S. In doing so, it was a good reminder to me as someone who studies the U.S. and tends to be too focused on the U.S. Than I should be, to really broaden the scope of the places and the people I examine. And from the very start, his Trans-Pacific scope offers a critique of American empire through and across the Pacific. What I appreciate about this work is that Justin considers the connections and movement of people between these different sites. And the result is a narrative that decenters the nation state and focuses instead on the religious people who make very complex choices that reflect politics that are very, very local and very global at the same time. So this book is a really excellent example of why we need to study Asian American religious life through a Trans-Pacific lens, because we see the great variety of Cantonese Protestant belief, community, practice, and identity. We see the different challenges to the desire by lots of people to keep the church separate from the secular world. We saw all the different ways people try to draw a boundary between the church and the secular, the very different political trajectories that Cantonese Protestants have charted for themselves, and the different ways that they do politics. Look, a second thing that I love about this book is that it offers a very complex and engaging portrait of Asian American or Asian Pacific American and Trans-Pacific civic life and political life. Justin talks about Cantonese Protestants as a sheet of scattered sand, characterized by diversity, disunity, dysfunction, disorganization. This is a book with a lot of complicated characters, complicated communities that are infighting a lot. And I kind of love the details, the juicy details about this person saying that thing about that person. I'm maybe a little gossipy, so I like that dimension of the project. And I read this book the first time in the aftermath of the 2024 election in the United States. And it was helpful for me to think about this book as a reminder of the fact that coalitions are very fragile. The way we need to understand political life is global, of course, but also very local and characterized by lots of complicated human relationships, fragile coalitions, everyday people who are wary of politics, wary of one another. And so I was reminded of the danger of telling a single story about trying to explain a political movement. We tend to do that in the United States. We tend to do that as scholars, trying to tell a simple story about why a thing happened. And this book was a reminder that, well, no, there are many different stories. We need to do scholarship that reflects that. Finally, I think about this book now as the global economy is collapsing, as we see a president in the United States claim Liberation Day by imposing tariffs. It is a very different moment to consider this book. And one question I want to pose to Justin is how does his book and the people he met help us understand how people around the world might be engaging in this moment, experiencing this moment. At the very beginning of the book, Justin makes clear that the idea of the Pacific Rim is a dream. And that is very clear in the current moment. The idea of some harmonious world connected through trade and faith and migration, that seems to me to be breaking down quite a bit now. And so, yeah, I'm curious, Justin, I know you studied the past, but I'm curious about what you studied during this period and how it might connect to what's going on now and how we might understand the people in your book and how they might be experiencing the transitions that the U.S. and the world is experiencing right now.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Our second panelist is Dr. Choi, who serves as the Kun Sik Chan Professor of Asian American Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary. A Christian ethicist by training, his research and teaching draws from the fields of theological aesthetics, peace studies, and critical ethnic studies. Choi's publications include Disciplined by Race, Theological Ethics, and the Problem of Asian American Identity. And most recently, Art and Moral Change, a re-examination. He currently serves as the co-editor of the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics.
Great. Thank you, Professor Kwok, for inviting me to be a part of this event to celebrate Justin's new book. And thanks to Justin for writing this important book. I'm just going to say this. I have to say this out loud because we all love Justin precisely for this. I'm a huge admirer of Justin's exuberant wit and tireless intellect, both of which are on fine display in this new book. When you read this book, you really hear Justin's voice, which I think which makes it such a terrific book to read. Since I don't have a lot of time to engage Justin's book, for the sake of encouraging collective conversation, all I will do is raise 3 questions prompted by at least 3 identities that I claim for myself. First, as an Asian American theologian and ethicist. Second, as an Asian American committed to democratic politics. And I think Melissa sort of answers my second question a little bit for Justin. But whether or not Justin, if that's how you would respond, I'd be curious. And third, as an East Coast Asian American, one who hails from New York City more specifically. So first, as someone who works in the area of Asian American theology, I read with great curiosity Justin's attempt at trying to understand the political theology of Cantonese Christians. On his telling, the Cantonese Christians, those residing in Hong Kong, San Francisco, and Vancouver, are theologically fragmented, which is to say more specifically that their public lives are not so much driven by specific or sustained theological reasons, but the realities of secular politics that informs their participation in the public sphere. As such, theological compromises are being made by Cantonese Protestants by virtue of these secular spaces. His chapter on Cantonese Protestants in San Francisco, I think, is a terrific case in point. But the way that Justin casts the religiosity of Cantonese Protestants within secular systems makes me wonder whether we can speak of or hope for a Cantonese Protestant political theology at all. This is not to suggest that the political and the religious can be neatly delineated. They can't. And it is not to say that the religious is separable from socio-political context. They cannot be separate. But it is to wonder whether Justin's account of Cantonese Protestantism allows room for theology to do critical work for Cantonese Protestants. If it can, then I'd be interested to hear Justin's thoughts on what that critical theological work might look like. Or is it Justin's point that the story of Cantonese Protestantism should ultimately be taken as a cautionary tale, one that should chasten folks like me, an Asian American theologian, from being too sanguine in thinking that Asian American Christianity can be a kind of countercultural, maybe even an emancipatory force? Second, as someone who thinks of himself as an Asian American Democrat, or a Democrat with a small d, let's just keep it at that, I read with great interest Justin's account of Cantonese Protestant participation in democratic politics. Given the anxiety that so many of us are feeling about the state of American democracy and where it might be heading, I could not help but wonder whether Justin's book had any lessons, perhaps Cantonese Protestant lessons, to offer regarding our present. To be more specific, consider the concluding lines of the last chapter of the book. And I'm just going to quote just real briefly here. He writes, Cantonese Protestants have become integrated into the democratic worlds of Pacific Rim civil societies through the narratives of Asian America in San Francisco, Chinese Christians in federal electoral writings in Metro Vancouver, and public theology in Hong Kong's political system. This integration I have suggested is an agreement about democracy, however vague it might be. And it is remarkable that it is an agreement about democracy. I'm paraphrasing a little bit right there. The sheet of the Pacific Rim, in other words, may well be a vaguely democratic one, but the various versions of democracy that Cantonese Protestants might advocate are the sands scattered on it. That's the end of the quote. It is this notion that Cantonese Protestants are bound by a commitment to democratic life, and that we can regard the various Cantonese Protestant communities within the Pacific Rim as particular versions or perhaps experiments in democracy, is what I find particularly intriguing. While there is so much consternation among some theologians such as me and political pundits about the turn to MAGA politics among communities of color, including Asian American communities, Justin's account of Cantonese Protestants as democratic advocates suggests that there might be good reasons to pay attention to Cantonese Protestants in this time of democratic peril. Hence, what might Cantonese Protestants teach us about democracy or democratic politics, especially now? And again, I think Melissa sort of gestured to an answer to this. I'm curious as to hear Justin's take on it. Lastly, let me ask a question that reflects my East Coast rootedness. And this is the question I'm most nervous about asking this question because I don't know if this is, just sort of East Coast bubble bias. Sometimes New Yorkers, I'm a New Yorker, have the tendency to think everything revolves around New York. And in many ways, many things do revolve around New York. So in that spirit, I ask the following. As an Asian American from the East Coast, I am intrigued by the setup of the book, the notion that, as Justin puts it, and I'm quoting from him, the Pacific Rim is the vehicle for the narrative of Asians who move into American, Canadian, and oceanic worlds as part of a very powerful dream about an integrated region between the Asia-Pacific and the Americas. So that the Pacific Rim functions this way for Cantonese Protestants in Hong Kong, Vancouver, and San Francisco is made abundantly clear in Justin's book. But Cantonese Protestant migration, however, is certainly not limited to the Pacific Rim, and specifically is not limited to the western coast of North America. Prominent Cantonese Protestant communities also have formed here in the East Coast, particularly in New York City. And Queens is, where I'm from, is the epicenter, as well as in Philadelphia and Toronto. I had to include Canada. Canada's getting, a lot of grief these days. I do not doubt that many of these East Coast Cantonese Protestant communities also experience the kind of secular tugs and pulls that Cantonese Protestant communities on the West Coast experience. But I do wonder whether a focus on East Coast Cantonese Protestants might complicate the explanatory power of the quote-unquote ideological engine of quote-unquote the Pacific Rim, or more broadly the Transpacific, and thus what integrating Asia and the Americas means from an East Coast Cantonese Protestant perspective. In other words, as much as geography and the secular matters to understanding Cantonese Protestantism, does it matter differently on which coast you're on? Would Cantonese Protestants on the East Coast recognize themselves in Justin's account of Cantonese Protestants on the West Coast? Would the dream of the Pacific Rim resonate with them? To some extent, my three questions, especially the first two, are normative in nature, and therefore it might be slightly unfair to ask questions given that Justin's book is not necessarily a project with normative theological and ethical aims. I'll admit that. But to the extent that Justin's book raises questions that invite or provoke us into normative territory, underscores the immense importance of this book. For that, I once again congratulate you, Justin, on your scholarly achievement.
Thank you very much, Casey. The third panelist is Ms. ChanHee Heo, who is a doctoral student in American religions at Stanford University. Her research interests include American religions in a global context, racial identity formation, inter-imperial relations in the Pacific, and Asian American history. She's finishing her dissertation on the evolving ideas of race, religion, and nation through transpacific connections between the United States and East Asia from the late 19th to the mid-20th century.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me be part of this conversation. And congratulations, Justin, on publishing such a wonderful book. Echoing Melissa, I love this book, and I'm sure a lot of us love this book. I'll share how I read this book first and its major contributions, and a couple of questions to continue our discussion. So Justin's book tells the stories of Cantonese-speaking Protestant Christians in three Pacific Rim civil societies, San Francisco, Vancouver, and Hong Kong, by tracing how Cantonese Protestants engaged in ongoing discussions about how to navigate the secular civil societies they inhabited. Justin demonstrates that Cantonese Protestant Christians define themselves through a process of negotiation instead of presenting a unified identity. Justin extends the phrase, a sheet of scattered sand, to describe the Cantonese Protestant Christians' ideological fragmentation and lack of institutional cohesion. This fragmentation, Justin argues, was not merely a matter of disorganization, but stems from deeper divisions over how to engage with secular discourses. In his exploration of these seemingly incoherent, conflicting efforts of self-definition, Justin, in fact, demonstrates that Cantonese Protestants engaged in a complex negotiation amid a web of context, contesting the assumed dominant narratives of Cantonese migrants or Cantonese Protestants in metropolitan cities. In his telling of stories, Justin introduces this concept he calls the quote-unquote dream of the Pacific Rim. This term refers to a set of imaginaries, particularly between 1989 and 2012, that sought to integrate global cities through an idealized vision of multicultural civil societies and democratic participation. I think this framework brings two important insights to transpacific religious studies. So first, I think this framework helps us to think of the Pacific beyond a geographically conceptualized site. Justin considers the Pacific as an ever-evolving site of complexity and fluidity, shaped and reshaped by political, economic, and cultural imaginaries. Using this framework, he demonstrates what Asian American studies scholar Tina Chen calls, quote-unquote, transpacific environmental consciousness that emanates from water's ability to both connect and separate, where its fluid connectivity brings together disparate histories and experiences of Cantonese Protestants in the Pacific Rim. Also, this framework encourages us to utilize imagination as a discursive category in transpacific religious studies. While scholars of religion have acknowledged the role that imagination plays for religious adherents, from everyday religious practices to the ways with which they build and envision community both locally and globally, scholarly conversations have in general placed less weight on imagination. As Robert Orsi highlights, however, the imagination takes hold of the world as the world takes hold of the imagination. Justin focuses not only on how Cantonese Christians imagine their role during a time of increasing capital flow, investment, and efforts toward Pacific integration, but also on how that imagination was expressed through individual and collective actions in the public sphere. Justin also shows the complicated nature of this imagination in relation to their historical memories of the Tiananmen Square protests. As the pain of these memories began to fade, many Cantonese Protestants were motivated less by historical wins than by immediate practical concerns. For example, turning toward a conservative party that more aligned with their present social and economic priorities. In this shift, Justin clearly shows how Cantonese Protestants reimagined themselves and how that reimagination guided them to remember the past. In relation to this point, another key aspect of Justin's work is how he developed a methodological approach in relation to his positionality. He used a triangulated methodology of semi-structured interviews with Cantonese Protestant leaders, focus group, and archival work. But what makes this especially interesting is his reflexive stance. This reflexive stance doesn't just come from his acknowledgement of his personal connections to the Bay Area and Vancouver, as well as his upbringing within Cantonese Protestant communities. He positions himself within the context where his interlocutors were situated as one of the scattered grains in the shed, a part of the very dream of Pacific Rim, as well as a researcher. And he consistently involves his interlocutors in his process of interpreting them while engaging with a broader historical and geographical context. So, with limited time, I should stop here, even though there are so many great things I want to talk about. So as I mentioned, Justin's work opens up so many productive methodological and theoretical conversations as well. And I would love to pose a couple of questions to keep the discussion going. My first question is, Justin's work frames the Pacific Rim through a temporally specific lens, focusing on experiences and imaginaries from 1989 to 2012. I wonder how Justin sees those same individuals and communities responding to continuing debates on issues of gender and sexuality and Chinese nationalism, particularly in relation to 2019-2020 Hong Kong protests and ensuing national security law. And what continuities or ruptures does he see in their negotiating process, and what do they tell him? My second question is, in a past interview, Justin noted how his perspectives on Cantonese Protestant communities have evolved from his dissertation to the publication of this book, reflecting both intellectual and personal transformation. In relation to his approach, how has this shift shaped his reflective approach to ethnographic work and the epistemological stakes of studying contested religious and secular formation? And in what ways has this evolution challenged or reaffirmed his ethical commitments in the process of knowledge production? Thank you again for having me, and I'm looking forward to the further discussion.
I would like to thank the panelists for their comments and remarks. Each look at the book from different perspectives and ask very good questions. Now I will call upon Justin to respond to some of the questions.
Thank you again, ChanHee, Casey, Melissa, for these very generous comments. Thanks, Pui-Lan, again for organizing this. I want to begin by addressing Casey's point about the East Coast. I'm on the East Coast right now as we speak. I'm in Washington, D.C., and that's partly because I'm taking this book kind of on tour to East Coast universities. I'll be at Yale, and I'll probably be at NYU, might be at Catholic University in the coming weeks. So I'm going to expect this question quite a bit. I don't think that the Pacific Rim is not applicable, if I can use the double negative, to the East Coast. And the reason is because the entire sort of American imaginary of manifest destiny is a transpacific vision, right? It's not just a vision of domination from coast to coast. It's a vision of domination from sea to sea, which is from the Atlantic to the Pacific, right? And so I think that this is something that Gary Okihiro taught me, and he's pretty explicit about this in his textbook, American History Unbound, Asians and Pacific Islanders. And so the first thing that I would say is that I think this is that because the Pacific Rim is an imaginary and not just a geography, we might find resonances of this among Cantonese Protestants in Chicago, in New York, in New Jersey, et cetera, in Atlanta, et cetera. Responding to both your and Melissa's comments on democracy, I also want to think about what ChanHee called my positionality now. I'm no longer a Cantonese Protestant. There's a reason why I'm in D.C. I'm at the St. Gabriel's Institute, which is a ministry of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. I'm Ukrainian Greek Catholic. I'm not Ukrainian. And the reason I became Greek Catholic was because of the Hong Kong protests, which was a sort of transpacific phenomenon for me in Vancouver. What happened was that Greek Catholics, from their experience of the Maidan in Kiev and other places in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014, widely supported the umbrella movement in 2014 in Hong Kong, and were kind of our spiritual leaders, directors in discerning what it means to engage in politics and even theologies of liberation in 2014 in Hong Kong. And so one of the things that changes after 2012 is the advent of Chinese cultural nationalism, and also people who don't want to be called Chinese, like Hong Kong people, like Taiwanese people, like some people who would have called themselves Chinese, but at least in the academy, we are moving more towards this language of the Sinophone, people who speak some kind of Chinese and are burdened by the nation state, by some kind of Chinese nation state for their loyalties. And so one thing that changes after 2012 is actually democracy movements in light of undemocratic formations in the Trans-Pacific. And I think the fact that we're now in 2025 and now we're talking about the lack of democracy, I'm like, wow, it's taken 12 years to get to where Hong Kong people have been for 12 or 13 years in the sense of sort of helplessness and hopelessness, right? And so we ask about democracy. Like, what does democracy look like in this time? I think that one of the things that highlighted both the umbrella movement and the 2019 anti-extradition law amendment bill protest was that Hong Kong people continued to behave as a sheet of scattered sand. They didn't use that term. In fact, in 2019, there was a bid for more unity. They called themselves the hand foot, 扫帚, right? But they also used this term 蓝潮, embrace the frying, right? In the sense that, as hands and feet, they were also screwed, right? And so there's this way where there's still a sense of scattering upon a sheet. And I would say that maybe the theoretical import of the sheet of scattered sand, perhaps helpful in this moment for understanding how people are all doing their own thing, but divided about the same thing.
Thank you very much, Justin, for your response. Now we have comments and questions and answers. As people are thinking, let me just ask this question. The book certainly uses a transpacific methodology. Justin, can you say a little bit more about your hope for future research or studies in this particular area?
Yeah, thanks, Puilan, for that question. So the directions that I'm moving in are towards a couple of sort of directions. One is sort of a continued study of social movements. And so something like the Hong Kong protests in the time of the national security law is very interesting and perilous to study in this moment in the political theology of Asian American representation, right? Because Asian Americans, Anglophone Asian Americans, have sort of represented ourselves in ways that sort of assume that there's a community behind us. The question is, what is that community? And then the third thing that I'm sort of wondering about is to what extent do communities of color and especially communities described as transpacific engage in ecological movements and are interested in ecological infrastructure. They do live on coastal cities. So how screwed are they? So these are some of the directions that I am pursuing in my future work, and these are things that to some extent have all have like grant money attached to them at some point that I'm trying to develop.
Justin, there is a question for you. If your Cantonese Protestants were organizing around marriage equality in the period that you wrote the book, what are they organizing around now?
That's a really good question. I would say that in the time since I wrote the book, and so this is why I ended the study in 2012. It was because with the advent of new democratic politics and the time of undemocracy in the Trans-Pacific, it's become a kind of dangerous time to organize. In the time of the Pacific Rim, there was this sort of liberal ethos where people could sort of organize openly and say that they were contributing to multicultural democracy with their conservative views. The question now is, are they openly organizing? And so some of the questions that I have had are, to what extent are Cantonese Protestants involved in things like overturning affirmative action? To what extent are they involved for or against Black Lives Matter? To what extent are they for or against both Donald Trump administrations? And the answer to those questions is these people are a sheet of scattered sand. So the answer is probably yes, and probably kind of. Some things that I have noticed also is that after 2012, there's much more of a Mandarin presence in these organizing movements. The other wild card is post-2019 Hong Kong people moving around who bring with them a new kind of politics that is different from the ones that I describe in the book, much more radically democratic and much more traumatized by the events in Hong Kong. That's sort of my non-answer answer to this question. What are they doing now? The reason is because the picture has changed so much since 2012. There's another question in the chat.
The question is, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church inspire you in the connection with the Hong Kong umbrella movement. Can you unpack that a bit more for what trans-denominational migration could mean for trans-Pacific political theological thinking in terms of any possible liberatory impulse?
So it's a really good question because my church is really small. The question of whether the 30 of us on a good Sunday, this liberatory movement, there's 30 of us on a good Sunday. And not all of us are Hong Kong people, and not all of us are political. The thing that we have in common is that we all sing badly. So the question is, to what extent can these trans-denominational movements be mobilized? I'm not sure that there's actually trans-denominational sort of movements. I know that I migrated from church to church because of a democracy movement, and I know that some of my friends did too. If I can come out of my sort of empirical geography shell and speak theologically, if that's allowed, I attribute that to a movement of the Holy Spirit. What I understand to have happened in my reception into the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is that the Spirit blew me into the arms of Holy Sophia, whose icon is mounted at every altar in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And under the mantle of the Most Holy Theotokos, I'm learning a spirituality of stillness. And so maybe what the spirit behind this question is, to what extent do we need to use the language of the Holy Spirit and to follow the movement of the Holy Spirit as we move towards liberation? Because where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom.
We have Wing Yin Lee.
I have a question that links to a brief answer to just now when it was asked where Trans-Pacific Studies is going. I'm reminded of an article that I read by Lisa Yoniyama toward a decolonial genealogy of Trans-Pacific. That article is really inspiring in the sense that it is interrogating with the notion of Trans-Pacific and how becomes a new replacement sometimes of the Pacific Rim. And this Trans-Pacific, it seems like there's a movement that goes with, that interrogate with the imperial power. But at the same time, Yoniyama is critiquing how actually oftentimes this kind of study, Trans-Pacific study, when it does not take on a decolonial lens and giving back to the voices of the people, for example, in the islands, in the Trans-Pacific, and realizing and uncovering the non-knowledge within the study, then this Trans-Pacific study ultimately become, or again, go back into the area study with the Cold War mentality. And that then reinforced the U.S. imperial dominance in this kind of narrative. And now, okay, that then comes to my question, because I'm realizing more and more, and this I grieve as well as coming from Hong Kong, many Cantonese communities are pro-Trump, and their idea of democracy also relies on a European, modern, neoliberal understanding of democracy. And so even when we are pursuing democracy, for example, in the Hong Kong protests, I don't know where we are getting. Except that we are almost falling back into that kind of imperial narrative, except that we're leaving Chinese imperial narrative, but we are fleeing to another one. So I wonder, what's your take on that, or what kind of method we can adopt when we're approaching Cantonese communities and seeing the insights that they bring for democracy?
Two very quick things, Wing Yin. I loved your question. The first thing that it reminded me of was an article that I read during the Umbrella Movement where Joshua Wong, face of the movement, wants to go to university to read John Rawls because he's so excited to read John Rawls because John Rawls will teach him distributive justice. Right now, I've never met anybody excited to read John Rawls. So that was an eye-opening thing. The second thing is the term Trans-Pacific, especially for Hoskins and Wen in that Trans-Pacific Studies reader, is a replacement of the term Pacific Rim because Pacific Rim has been criticized over and over for being a settler colonial formation. What I say in the book is we start there. We start by saying that the Pacific Rim is a series of settler colonial imaginary that reinforces American empire as hegemonic ideology in the Trans-Pacific. Now, why then study it? It's because, as Cantonese Heo puts it, the task of something like Asian American studies, which claims to some extent to be either post-colonial or decolonial, the task of Asian American studies is not just to study Asian American communities, but to study what Cantonese Heo called the transpacific social formation that is itself a kind of imperial power. And so the transpacific social formation is the kaleidoscope of political, economic, social, cultural, educational, and religious institutions that have transpacific reach and that extend the power of American empire. To do Asian American studies is to study that formation from the perspective of Asian Americans who are both oppressed by and collaborate with it. And so in that sense, studying the Pacific and the Trans-Pacific, I think we can take on the critique of the decolonial without apologizing on behalf of our research subjects. I think there's a really weird countertransference that happens when we do ethnography, where we're kind of speaking for platforming our research subjects. I hope that I'm not platforming them. I hope that their platform is the Pacific Rim, because that's the sheet they're on. They're not on Justin Sea. They're on the Pacific Rim. So that's my sort of gesture at an answer that can become a much longer conversation, because this is a very important critical question.
Can I ask another question to Justin here? I'm just curious as to, in your book, given the communities you study, the role of Tiananmen is important for one community, and then, of course, Hong Kong. The Tiananmen massacre is now rather long, if you will, right? And the memory of it is rather long. The memory of Hong Kong is relatively fresh. I'm wondering if the differences in the remembrances of these events makes a difference in the way that these communities think about themselves politically as well as theologically, and what that portends moving forward, given that not even in a decade, but certainly in half a dozen years, you can't imagine a lot of people even remembering Tiananmen Square.
Casey, that's a really good question, because in some ways, I had to think through that in writing chapter 5, which is titled The Fading Shadow of Tiananmen. And what I say in that chapter is basically that everyone seems inspired by Tiananmen in no discernible way. Like they'll say they're inspired by Tiananmen, and then they do things that are not Tiananmen related at all, right? Or that even undermine the goals of the movement. Or in the book is to inspire people to get involved in democratic politics. The move away from Tiananmen is basically this move to the right. So there's a couple of things to say about that, right? Which is that to some extent, some of the Tiananmen activists themselves who became Christians are also sort of veering towards the right. And so one question might also be, like, what kind of democracy is the legacy of Tiananmen kind of promoting? So that's the first question. Second thing is, I remember during even the Hong Kong protests, there was some discontent with comparing it to Tiananmen. The protesters would say that Hong Kong is not China. And so there was this sort of backlash about Tiananmen memorials, even during the Hong Kong protests. And this became a debate. Talk about a sheet of scattered sand. That's the sheet of scattered sand at work. The question becomes, to what extent is the memory of Tiananmen a Chinese memory? And to what extent is this word Chinese a burden on a community, right? And again, I feel like that returns us to the question of the Sinophone, because one of the things that Shumei Shi, who sort of came up with Sinophone studies, is that people who kind of speak Chinese, this is kind of what she suggests, people who speak some sort of Chinese are burdened by attachments to a nation state that they don't belong to, whether that nation state is the People's Republic or the Republic. And so Tiananmen has all of that baggage. Whereas Hong Kong, the baggage is different, right? The baggage is one of oppression of democracy movements in a global city that used to be attached to the Pacific Rim, and to the British Empire for that matter, right? And so I feel like that also explains why there were news stories about people, calling on Boris Johnson and Donald Trump at the time to fight China, right? And these Hong Kong protesters are all right wing. Well, they remember a formation of Hong Kong that was attached to the Pacific Rim and the British Empire. And those right wing symbols are symbols of that ongoing imperial project.
Thank you very much. for joining us tonight. And congratulations again to Justin for the publication of this very inspiring and wonderful book. I hope you will join other events sponsored by Cork and Roll in the future.